Hey guys, I think I'm gonna start up my own faction. Do you wanna join?
Why the heck would anyone join your stupid faction?
A great question, actually. What benefits would your faction offer to its members?
Well, I have a druid, and they're just big fat hit point sponges. I mean, they're mostly worthless otherwise, but he's gonna help keep the rest of us alive.
What do you mean worthless? I have a kitty cat.
Hit point sponge. I like it. I'm in.
Yep, me too.
Heck yeah, sign me up. I'm gonna use the druid as a practice dummy.
Wow, this is so exciting. I'm gonna be a faction leader, and you're all gonna have to do what I say.
Oh crap, we're all screwed.
Welcome to the DM Lair. I'm Lucar, and I've been a Dungeon Master since high school. On this channel, I give practical Dungeon Master advice that you can implement at your game table. Today in the Lair, we'll be discussing how to use factions in your D&D games, and the homebrew faction favor system I've developed and use in my games. And if you have any questions about this topic or anything else Dungeon Master or D&D related, I have live streams here on YouTube pretty much every Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern US time. And the first couple hours are usually focused on just answering questions from the chat. Now, before we jump into it, a message from the Barbarian.
Hello, people! Before we talk about how to murder your players with factions, I just want to thank all of my wonderful patrons and YouTube channel members who help support the channel and also help pick the topic of this video. In particular, I want to thank all of the beautiful people whose name you see over here. Oh wow, that's a lot of people. Oh, and if you're interested in becoming a patron or YouTube channel member, there are links down below in the description. I can't really see them down there, but you should be able to.
All right, factions. Let's do this. Factions are basically large organizations that are at work in the game world. They can be temples, guilds, secret societies, governments, and even big bad guys. Big bad guys? Big bads? Big bads, that sounds a little bit better. For instance, in my Sword Coast Guard game, the main factions are the Lords of Waterdeep, the town of Rasalantar, the good gravy. I made this word, I can't even say it. Drazavonites? We're gonna go with Drazavonites, that's all I got there. Anyway, that is a cult. But, oh yeah, this is the problem when you make up generic fantasy names for things and then you can't pronounce them later. Anyway, we also have the Hags of the Feywild and of course, Lord Paxton. You might notice that none of the standard factions, such as the Harpers or the Zentarum, even come into play in my Sword Coast Guard game. That's because ideally, you want to custom tailor the factions to use for your specific campaign. And then, basically, the way factions work is that they are active in the game world at the same time your players are. That means that the Lords of Waterdeep and Lord Paxton are both up to stuff at the same time the PCs are delving into dungeons or screwing around on some side quest. And ideally, from time to time, or maybe even all of the time, your players will interact with these factions at some level. That could be as simple as the Lords of Waterdeep reaching out to the heroes for help with a tribe of orcs amassing to the north. And then, when the heroes defeat the orcs, they gain favor with the Lords of Waterdeep faction. Or your players might align themselves against the goals and objectives of a specific faction and choose to oppose them over the course of the entire campaign. This is exactly what my players did with Lord Paxton. Once they found out that Lord Paxton was slowly conquering or annexing the territory along the Sword Coast, they took it upon themselves to stop him. Of course, this was the central tension of the campaign as well. Why use factions? Okay, if the basic idea of factions doesn't already sound cool and like something you might want to use in your game, allow me to convince you a little bit further. Using factions in your game makes the world seem larger and more complex and more realistic to your players. Factions also give dungeon masters a powerful tool that they can use in their games. Factions do crap, they get stuff done, and the things they do can introduce drama and tension into your game, which should be one of your main goals as a dungeon master. Lord Paxton has his army of orcs besiege the town of Rasalantar, and then the Lords of Waterdeep ask the heroes to help. There you go. That's tension, drama, and a quest for your players to go on. Factions can also be used to add some lightweight politics to the game. In my Hand of Light game, the players used some flippant words and pissed off the Guild of Apothecaries and Physicians, one of the factions in that game. And then they had to engage in some basic politics and negotiations, and an adventure, of course, to appease them. Factions, and especially when you combine it with the faction favor system I'm going to discuss a little bit later, give your players an objective to work toward. Namely, through their actions, they can increase their favor with certain factions and get in-game benefits. The converse is true too. Since bad guys are often representatives from certain factions, as the heroes thwart the villain's plans, they lose favor with those factions. And then there are in-game consequences, such as the faction sending assassins after the heroes when their relations finally hit rock bottom. All of these mechanics reinforce verisimilitude in your game. That is, your game seems more realistic to your players. It feels more like a living, breathing world than just something you all are imagining in your heads. And that's probably something that most dungeon masters should be striving for. The feeling realistic part, not the imagining it in your head part. How to implement factions. Factions and organizations are discussed in the Dungeon Master Guide starting on page 21. However, the system there discusses a faction system whereby each player's character might belong to one or more factions that are different than the factions other characters might belong to. Now, I don't implement factions that way in my games, but let's talk about that method briefly, just in case the idea interests you, or you're running a module like Waterdeep Dragon Heist that encourages you to have each player pick a faction to join. Basically, with the individual faction method, each player is a member of one faction, or possibly more, and they can gain favor with that faction by doing things that align with that faction's goals. The downside I see with implementing individual faction favor is that it detracts from the group gameplay and creates silos where players are working individually on their own goals. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it can give your players something cool to pursue that interests their characters. However, they would need to pursue those individual interests as part of their downtime activities, or maybe even during special one-on-one game sessions with the Dungeon Master. That is, unless you're okay with spending a significant amount of table time having just one player playing the game. And that is not something I recommend, as chances are the other players won't find it very enjoyable to sit by and do nothing while one person plays the game. So you're back to having it be part of downtime activities, which shouldn't take up too much table time, but also makes it kind of a sideshow. Or you have to run special sessions for your players. And I'll caution you to only go down that route if you think you'll have enough time and inclination to do that. Or you could build their individual faction interests into the larger campaign and have them intersect at various points. That would require some planning and coordination, though it could be very cool. So basically, to absolve myself of all that added work and headache, I made things simpler by implementing faction favor as a group mechanic. That is, the entire group gains or loses favor with factions based on what the group does, usually as part of the adventures that they go on. For instance, when the Sword Coast Guard defeated the orcs besieging their castle, Gauntlet Hall, they lost favor with Lord Paxton, but gained favor with the Lords of Waterdeep. And this favor lost and gained was tracked as group favor, not individual favor. And the way I do it, the adventuring group themselves usually don't actually belong to any given faction. They are their own entity, their own force to be reckoned with. Instead, the amount of favor they have with other factions simply influences those factions' disposition toward them. In other words, the group gets benefits from high favor with the faction, and there are consequences for low favor. And I'll show you specifics on that in just a bit. By implementing group faction favor the way I have, I make things easier for me as the Dungeon Master and maintain the group aspect of the game. You see, I run group games. I want the group to be together. I want them to adventure together. I want to resolve things together as a group. So the more I can do in my game to encourage this, the better. Which factions to use? There's no specific answer for which exact factions to use in your game. What you want to do is pick factions that reinforce the central tension and the basic storyline of your campaign. For instance, Lord Paxton represents a faction because he's the main villain at the head of a large empire. And I knew the Lords of Waterdeep would probably be a faction because the players would be helping them against Lord Paxton. And then you want to let factions evolve organically in your game. Remember the Guild of Apothecaries and Physicians from my earlier example? Well, I had no plans for them to become a major player in the game, until my players pissed them off and brought them into the forefront of events. So then they became an important faction in the game. Also, if your game takes place in a pre-made campaign world, such as the Forgotten Realms, you could just pick some factions already established in that game. For instance, the Harpers, Order of the Gauntlet, Emerald Enclave, Lord's Alliance, and Zentarum could be major factions in your game. Then you would just need to figure out why and what they're up to in your campaign. My faction favor system. Okay, now I'm going to quickly walk through the faction favor system, exactly how I use it in my Sword Coast Guard game. What you're seeing on screen right now are my notes in OneNote for that game. You can see a list of the factions in the game in the chart on the left. The factions in green are good factions, and those in yellow are bad factions. The favor that they have with each faction is then listed in that chart. The players started the game with 10 favor in each faction because that is the neutral state. Then their actions either positively or negatively affected their favor, increasing it or decreasing it. For instance, when they lifted the siege on Gauntlet Hall, they earned 2 favor with the Lords of Waterdeep and lost 1 favor with Lord Paxton. You'll also notice that their favor with several of the factions is close to 10. That's because they didn't do much over the course of the campaign to change their favor with those factions. One faction, the Red Sashes, never even came into play during the game, even though I had originally imagined that it would. To the right here, you can see what the numbers in the favor scale represent too. If players increase their favor, they can become friends and even champions of a faction. As favor decreases, they become first enemies and then mortal enemies. That sliding scale of favor represents how predisposed a faction is to help the players, or how predisposed a faction is to oppose the players, perhaps even going out of their way to murder them. For instance, my Sword Coast Guard players have on occasion approached the Lords of Waterdeep asking for favors and aid based on their high favor with them. And Lord Paxton has on several occasions sent hit squads after them. By the way, down in the description, I've placed a link where you can download my basic faction favor system for use in your own game.
Hello people, me again. Let me know down in the comments how many fingers I have painted on my face. Next week we'll be talking about some overpowered magic items and what you can do to fix them. But until then, click on the thumbnail right here to watch my entire homebrew creation playlist. Yeah, that sounds fun.
And until next time, let's play D&D.